Okay, so let's just go over a few scenarios and discuss evaluating studies. Some of you might be using more informative sources, and these are just a few guidelines you should keep in mind if you're coming across a study that was conducted. First of all, remember that primary sources are preferable. Primary sources are sources that are original. In a historical sense, it might be a written record that was made directly for that time, maybe somebody's journal or maybe an official report of some kind. In more contemporary research, it might be an article written by the author who conducted the study. So, primary sources will probably give you a lot more information than a secondary source would. Secondary sources are acceptable, but with secondary sources, you want to make sure that the authors include background on who conducted the study and how that study was conducted, but the more in depth, the better. So, here's a few guidelines that you should follow when evaluating a study. First, ask yourself, is the sample size reasonable? The sample size, that refers to the participants involved in the study. So, if it's a survey, how many people were surveyed? Was it just 10? Was it 100? You want to make sure that the author at least gives you the information, and then you want to ask yourself, is that sample size large enough to make a generalization about the whole? And try not to completely discredit a source simply because their sample size could be larger. You might want to ask yourself how much work would be involved for it to be larger than it is. I remember I had a student who gave her source a negative evaluation because she didn't think the sample size was large enough. But when I reviewed it myself, I thought she was being a little too hard on the source because the source was investigating the long-term effects child abuse had on individuals, and it was tracking them over a period of 20 years. So I can't remember the exact number she had, but it started out much larger than it ended because some of the subjects ended up moving away and the researchers lost track of them. Some of them passed away before the study was completed. So in a long-term study over 20 years, it certainly would be more difficult to track a large number of people than a simple survey that's sent out over the internet. Along with considering that the sample size is reasonable, ask yourself, is it a representative sample? In other words, does the background of the participants reflect the whole population in question? This means that you want to consider factors that would affect a study, such as gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, political affiliation. All of those won't count for every single study, but if it's a medical study, you don't want just male participants or female participants if it's about a condition that could affect both genders. If you're trying to predict the next president, you don't want to interview only Democrats or only Republicans. You want to have a sample that reflects the whole. So basically, you want to consider what factors would affect the outcome of the study and make sure that your sample reflects the whole. So you also want to ask yourself, does the evidence provided support the conclusion for the study? Is there a direct relationship between the evidence that they're providing and the claim that they're using that evidence to support? If there is, that's good. If not, perhaps they're committing a logical fallacy of some kind. And if the author gives percentages, you want to make sure that they include the number that that percentage represents. You don't want to just look at 100%, 50%. 50% doesn't mean a lot if it's 1 out of 2 people surveyed, but it would mean a lot more if it's out of 1,000 or 1,000,000 people. So you want to make sure that they give you the numbers so that you understand the meaning of those percentages, and then you want to ask yourself, are the numbers as convincing as the percentages? If they're telling you that it's 50%, but you find out there's only 2 people in the sample size, then you might consider that the author is manipulating the information being provided. So let's look at a few sample studies. These are just short little samples for us to look at in this video, and we'll point out some aspects you want to pay attention to when you're evaluating information that you come across in your own research.
In 3 weeks, students, faculty, and staff members of Spring Community College will vote to decide whether smoking on campus will be banned. Benjamin Smith wants to predict the results, so he surveyed random people to find out whether they support the ban on smoking. 70% of the people interviewed oppose the ban, so Benjamin Smith predicts that the ban will not be approved.
If this happened at your school, hopefully you would question Benjamin Smith's prediction. We don't have very much information at all about how he conducted the study. We have this percentage, 70%. However, you want to remember that without knowing the number that percentage represents, percentages really mean nothing. So 70%, let's say the total population, including students, faculty, and staff members, is 5,000 people. If he interviews all 5,000 of them and 70% of them oppose the ban, then that's 3,500 people. However, if he just interviews 10 people, we just have 7. So there's a huge difference in the reliability behind the sample size. The more, the better, basically always. So you can't always fault an author for not having enough, because you can always say they could have more. But ask yourself, would it be very difficult for them to enlarge their sample size if it turns out that Benjamin Smith interviewed only 10 people? If it's just a simple yes or no question, do you support this ban on smoking? It seems like he could probably put a little bit more effort into it. So he could send out an email survey even, and maybe send it out to all 5,000 people. Maybe not all of them would respond, but that would certainly improve his results.
Not knowing how many people he interviewed is probably the biggest problem with the scenario. The other problem is that his sample is random.
Now, you might think that a random sample would be reliable because you're not showing any personal bias in selecting the makeup of your sample. However, random isn't as effective as it might seem, because you could randomly select all smokers, for instance, or all non-smokers, or all students, or all faculty members. So you really don't want to have a random sample. Remember, you want to have a representative sample. So, for instance, let's say students make up 75% of the population. Then if you have a sample size of 100, you want 75 students to be in that sample size. Maybe you could randomly select the students, but you'd want 75 members of the sample size to be students. If faculty makes up 15% of the population, then you want 15 faculty members in your sample. If staff members make up 10%, then you want 10 staff members. So you want to think about the factors that would affect their view of whatever issue. In this case, it's a ban on smoking, and make sure that you factor that into your sample size. You want to look at the makeup of the whole, and then make sure that proportionately your sample size reflects that population. So have a sample size that has a proportionate amount of students, a proportionate amount of faculty members, a proportionate amount of staff members, and then think of other factors that might influence their view on a ban of smoking, such as maybe how many of them actually smoke. If 10% of the faculty members smoke, 10% of the faculty members that you choose for your sample should also be smokers. If 5% of the students smoke, then 5% of the students that you choose should be smokers. 5% of staff members, then 5% of the staff members in your sample. So you basically just want your sample size to be proportionate to the whole. Whatever factors that you think would influence somebody's view on a topic, make sure that they are accurately represented. Okay, so let's look at one more quick passage.
Half of the female applicants to the Peterson Academy of Computer Sciences failed the admissions exam, compared to only 25% of the male applicants. That shows that women are not as capable of developing computer skills as men.
Here's another example of where percentages mean nothing. Again, we hear that half of the female applicants to this academy failed the admissions exam compared to 25% of the male applicants, but we don't know how many applied in total. So if 10,000 female applicants applied and 5,000 of them failed, then that's a significant percentage. But if it turns out that only 2 females applied and 1 of them failed, that doesn't seem to be enough evidence for us to say that women are not as capable of developing computer skills as men, especially if the 25% of the male applicants is actually 200 out of 800. So comparing 200 out of 800 to 1 out of 2, it's not a fair comparison. Sounds impressive without those backing numbers, but once you hear the sample size, it's not really supporting their claim. So, as you're coming across information in the world, as you're doing your academic research, just always remember that people are flawed. They might seem like they have authority when they're putting their thoughts down in writing, but you just want to remember that, people, they're not perfect. They're not always well informed. They don't always have the best intentions. You don't necessarily want to assume that they have bad intentions, but you want to just think for yourself. Look at the evidence that they're providing, make sure that they're providing you with evidence, make sure that they're being honest, that they're qualifying their claims. And then when you make your own arguments, you'll really get a lot more credit for your ideas if you take those guidelines into account yourself. If you make realistic arguments that are well thought out, that are properly qualified, you're not jumping to extremes, you're not exaggerating, people will give you a lot more credit for your ideas, and you'll find yourself with a lot more influence in this world.